The train groaned. A beast of iron and steam crawling through God's forgotten country. Outside, the world was painted in shades of rust and bone. The sun, a merciless hammer, beat down on the cracked earth, and the heat shimmered in waves that made the distant mesas tremble. It was a land that promised nothing and took everything. A canvas of such brutal emptiness that it could swallow a man's soul whole, leaving only a whisper of dust. Inside the last car, the heat was a physical weight. It smelled of hot metal, coal smoke, and the stale breath of the few passengers who dotted the hard wooden benches. They were ghosts in the afternoon glare, faces slack with a heat-induced stupor, their gazes fixed on the unforgiving landscape as if waiting for a sign that never came. Silas was one of them, though he wasn't waiting for anything. He had learned long ago that waiting was a fool's game. The land didn't give signs, it gave truths. And the truth was that you endured or you broke. He sat with his back to the wall, his long frame folded into the corner, a position of habit that kept the world in front of him. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but the light from the window caught the hard lines of his jaw and the sun-bleached ends of his dusty hair. He was a man made of the same material as the land outside, weathered, quiet, and unyielding. His hands, resting on his knees, were rope-scarred and calloused, maps of a life lived by pulling, holding, and letting go. He expected nothing from the day, or the next, because expectations were a kind of debt, and he was a man who preferred to travel light. The rhythm of the rails was a familiar lullaby, the click-clack a steady heartbeat against the vast silence. He wasn't going anywhere in particular, just moving. It was what he did when the stillness of one place became too loud. He'd work a ranch until the seasons turned and his thoughts started circling back to things best left buried. And then he'd catch a train, letting the motion scour him clean. Then the door at the far end of the car slid open with a jarring screech, letting in a blast of hotter, dustier air. A girl stood there, framed for a moment against the blinding light. She was little more than a slip of a thing, clutching a small, worn carpet bag to her chest like a shield. She swayed with the motion of the train, her eyes wide and dark in a pale face, darting around the car like a cornered animal searching for an escape that wasn't there. Her dress, a simple calico, was rumpled and smudged with dirt, the hem torn in one place. She wasn't traveling, she was running. It was in the set of her shoulders, the tremor in her hands, the way her breath came in shallow, panicked bursts. The few other passengers barely registered her, their gazes slow to lift from their stupor. But Silas saw her. He saw it all in a single, practiced glance. He had seen that look before in wild horses, in steers separated from the herd, in men who had seen the wrong card turned. It was the look of pure, gut-deep fear. He lowered his head a fraction more, hoping the brim of his hat would be enough to make him part of the shadows. Trouble had a way of finding a man, and he'd had his share. The girl, Ellie, stumbled forward as the train lurched. Her gaze swept past the sleeping drummer, the weary-looking woman with two listless children, and then it landed on him. It wasn't a plea, not at first. It was an assessment. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, lingered on his still form. She saw the dusty duster coat that fell to his worn boots, the solid set of his shoulders against the wall, the complete lack of interest in his posture. He was a rock, a piece of the landscape brought inside. He looked like he belonged to the silence, like he wouldn't be startled by a sudden noise. She moved toward him, her steps hesitant but driven by a force greater than her caution. The air in the car seemed to thicken, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels growing louder, counting down seconds. She stopped before him, her shadow falling over his boots. For a long moment, she just stood there, breathing hard. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her. He gave her nothing. Perhaps that was what she needed, not a welcome, but an absence of rejection. "Mister," she whispered. Her voice was thin, fragile, like a dry leaf about to crumble. "Please." Silas didn't move a muscle. He kept his eyes on the floor between his feet. He could smell her fear, a scent as sharp as sweat and desperation. He didn't want to hear the story. He didn't want to know the names or the reasons. Every story was a rope, and every rope could become a noose. She took another shaky breath. "They're looking for me, on the train." Her voice cracked on the last word. "Please, I saw you. You look like you know how to be invisible." That almost made him look up. Invisible. He'd been called many things in his life, but never that. He was a large man. Invisibility wasn't a luxury he was afforded, but he understood what she meant. He knew how to be still. He knew how to occupy a space without disturbing the air around it. He remained silent. A test. If she was hysterical, if she started to weep or wail, he would ignore her until she went away. But she didn't. She just stood there, her terror a silent, screaming thing in the space between them. "Can I?" She swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the front of the car and then back to him. "Your coat. It's big. Can I hide?" The request was insane, a child's idea of a hiding place. He was a stranger, a man with a face that had seen too much sun and not enough kindness. And she was asking to crawl into his shadow. He could feel the fine hairs on the back of his neck prickle. This was it, the moment you turn away, or the moment you step in. He had turned away 100 times. It was easier. It was smarter. From the next car forward, he heard a man's voice, loud and coarse, followed by a rough laugh. Ellie flinched as if struck. A small, desperate sound escaped her lips. Her eyes met his, and this time it was a direct hit. There was no artifice, no guile. It was the purest form of pleading he had ever seen. It wasn't asking for a hero. It was asking for a hole to crawl into, a patch of darkness to disappear inside. Her gaze didn't ask him to save her. It only asked him to erase her for a moment. He thought of a doe he'd once seen, frozen in the brush, a hunter's dog barking just yards away. She had held so perfectly still. Her life depended on the hope that she was just another part of the scenery. Slowly, deliberately, Silas lifted the edge of his heavy canvas duster. He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his face an impassive mask. The gesture was his only answer. It was a small movement, but it felt momentous, like shifting a rock that had been settled for a century. He created a small cave of shadow and leather and dust. He heard her sharp intake of breath, a sound of disbelief and desperate gratitude. Without another word, Ellie sank to her knees and scrambled into the space he'd made. She curled into a tight ball at his side, pulling her worn bag in with her. The coat fell back into place, cloaking her completely. The world for her shrank to darkness and sensation. It smelled of the man of sun-baked dust, leather, faint tobacco, and something else, something clean and elemental, like sagebrush after a rain. The rough fabric of his trousers pressed against her cheek. Beneath the rhythmic clatter of the train, she could hear the slow, steady beat of his heart. It was a solid, reassuring sound in the midst of her own frantic pulse. The heavy canvas of the coat was a suffocating weight, but it was also a fortress wall. Silas did not shift. He became stone. He felt the light, trembling weight of her against his leg. He could feel the warmth of her body, the frantic energy of her fear. It was an unwelcome intrusion, a complication he had traveled hundreds of miles to avoid. Yet, he had allowed it. He had opened the door. He didn't ask himself why. Some things didn't have reasons. A man pulls a calf from a bog. He shoots a lame horse. He gives a thirsty stranger a drink from his canteen. He lifts his coat for a terrified girl. There was no thought to it. It just was. He rested his hands on his knees again, his posture unchanged. To anyone who might glance his way, he was just a solitary cowboy dozing in the corner, his coat bunched around him against the grime of the train. Nothing to see. The door to the car screeched open again. Beneath the coat, Ellie went rigid. Her breathing stopped. Silas felt the tremor go through her. He remained perfectly still, his own breathing slow and even. Heavy boots stomped into the car. 3 of them. He didn't need to look to know the type. Men who walked like they owned the ground they stood on, their presence sucking the air out of the room. Their voices were low and ugly. "Check this one of them grunted. Silas listened to their progress down the aisle. He heard them rouse the sleeping drummer, who grumbled in protest. He heard the woman shush her children, pulling them closer. Every footstep was a hammer blow against his calm. He focused on the horizon outside the window, on the unblinking sun. He made his mind as empty as the desert. The boots stopped beside him. He could feel the heat from another man's body. He smelled cheap whiskey and stale sweat. "What about this one?" a voice asked. "Closer now." "He's sleeping," another one rasped. "Just some broke cowpoke." A shadow fell over him. He felt eyes on him, studying him. He didn't flinch. He didn't breathe any deeper. He was just a man, tired from the heat, lulled by the tracks. He was nothing. Beneath the coat, Ellie held her breath until her lungs burned. She pressed her face into the rough fabric of his trousers, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, praying to the stillness of this stranger. There was a long, agonizing pause. The only sounds were the creak of the car and the click-clack of the wheels on the track. Then, a grunt of dismissal. "Waste of time. She's probably in the baggage car. Come on." The boots moved away. The door at the far end screeched open and then slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The tension in the car slowly began to seep away, like water into dry sand. Silas waited. He counted the rail clicks, 100 of them, then 200. He waited until the rhythm of the train felt normal again, until the air no longer felt charged with menace. He felt the girl against his leg begin to tremble, not from fear now, but from the release of it, a silent, violent shudder. He still said nothing. He didn't move to comfort her. He simply continued to be her shield, her patch of darkness. The train rolled on, deeper into the vast, indifferent wilderness. They were 2 strangers, one hidden in shadow, the other providing it, bound by a silent promise made in the face of fear. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. And still, he did not move, and she did not emerge. There were no words for what had passed between them. There didn't need to be. The train rattled on, a metronome counting out a fragile piece under the coat. Ellie's shudder subsided, replaced by a tense, listening stillness. The world was muffled, a distant rumble of wheels and the slow, steady drum of the man's heartbeat next to her ear. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. Safety was a borrowed thing, a fragile tent of canvas and shadow, and she knew it could be ripped away at any moment. Silas remained a statue of patience, his eyes half-lidded, fixed on the passing landscape. But he was no longer dozing. Every nerve was awake, every sense tuned to the sounds of the train. He had dealt himself into a game he hadn't wanted to play, and now he had to see the hand through. The girl's fear was a current running through him, a responsibility he felt pressed against his leg. He had seen the men's faces when they'd entered. They weren't the kind to give up easily. They had the dead-eyed look of wolves who had caught a scent and would run their prey to the ground, no matter how long it took. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun dipped lower, painting the inside of the car in long, distorted shadows. A false sense of calm began to settle. The woman across the aisle finally allowed her children to whisper. The drummer snored softly. Maybe they had been wrong. Maybe the men had moved on to other cars, convinced she wasn't here. Then the door at the front of the car slammed open again. Harder this time. The sound was a gunshot in the quiet car. Ellie's entire body went rigid. Silas didn't move, but he felt the jolt of her terror as if it were his own. It was them. He knew it without looking. Their footsteps were heavier now, angrier. "I'm telling you, Jeb, she's on this train," the coarse voice from before snarled. "She's small. Could be anywhere. We look again, and this time we tear the whole damn place apart." Silas's mind worked with cold, swift clarity. There would be no more hiding. They would pull him to his feet, rip the coat away. The girl would be exposed. He had a pistol tucked into his waistband, but drawing it in this cramped space against 3 men was a fool's bet. There would be a fight. People would get hurt, and the girl would be caught in the middle. There was only one other way. A bad way, but it was the only one they had. He glanced out the window. The train was slowing, beginning the long, gradual grade up into the foothills. It wasn't slow enough to be safe, but it was slow enough to be possible. The ground outside was a steep, gravelly embankment dropping into a dry wash littered with sagebrush and creosote. It would hurt, but it was better than the alternative. His decision was made in the space of a single heartbeat. He leaned his head down slightly, his lips near the crown of her head, hidden by the coat. His first words to her were a low, urgent whisper that cut through her panic. "Don't scream. When I move, you move with me. Understand?" She gave a convulsive, tiny nod against his leg. There was no time to question, no time for fear to paralyze her. His voice was calm and absolute, a command that left no room for argument. The footsteps were halfway down the aisle. "You, in the corner," one of the men barked. "Get up. Let's see your face." That was the signal. In one fluid, explosive motion, Silas was on his feet. He wasn't a man waking from a stupor. He was a predator uncoiling. He grabbed Ellie with him, one arm clamped around her waist like a steel band, lifting her clear off the floor. Her small carpet bag was still clutched in her hand. She gave a choked gasp, her world tilting violently. For a split second, the 3 men stared, their faces a mask of surprise. They saw the grim cowboy, his face set like granite, and the girl held tight against his side. The surprise curdled into rage. "It's her!" They lunged. But Silas was already moving. He didn't move toward them or away from them. He took 2 powerful strides toward the window, a solid wall of motion. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. With Ellie crushed against him, he threw his shoulder into the glass. The windows shattered in a deafening explosion, spraying the car with glittering shards. The wind roared in, a sudden, violent scream. Before the men could close the distance, before the other passengers could do more than cry out in shock, Silas launched himself through the empty frame and into the void. For Ellie, time fractured. There was the gut-wrenching sensation of falling, the roaring wind stealing the breath from her lungs, a blurred vision of sky and rock and rushing earth. Silas's arm was the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos. He twisted in midair, positioning his body to take the brunt of the impact. They hit the embankment with a brutal, jarring force. It wasn't a clean landing. It was a crash. The world became a violent tumble of pain, dust and tearing sound. Rocks scraped and gouged. Thorny bushes ripped at their clothes. Silas held on to her, his body shielding hers as they rolled and slid down the steep incline, finally coming to a stop in a heap at the bottom of the wash. Silence. A profound, ringing silence that was more shocking than the noise that had preceded it. The only sound was the fading clatter of the train as it continued up the grade. Disappearing around a bend, it was gone. Their connection to the world was gone. Ellie lay gasping, her lungs on fire. Dust filled her mouth and nose. Every part of her body ached with a dull, throbbing pain. She was alive. She pushed herself up, coughing, and looked at Silas. He was already on one knee, his head up, listening. A long, bloody gash ran down his cheekbone, and his knuckles were raw, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the top of the embankment where they had fallen. "Get up," he said, his voice raspy. He didn't offer a hand. There was no time for courtesy. She scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking uncontrollably. The heat of the desert floor rose through the thin soles of her shoes. An immediate, oppressive force. The sun was a physical weight. "They'll stop the train," he said, his voice flat and hard. "They'll be back." He grabbed her by the arm, not ungently, but with an undeniable urgency. and started pulling her down the wide, sandy wash. It was like running on a treadmill of hot coals. The loose sand sucked at her feet, making every step a monumental effort. Her lungs burned. Her simple dress offered no protection from the relentless sun. I can't, she panted after a few hundred yards, stumbling to a halt. Silas stopped, turning to face her. His expression was grim, unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might leave her. He was a stranger. She was nothing to him. He had done more than enough. But he didn't. He took a step closer. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "You run, or they find you. It's that simple. There's no one else coming to help." His words were harsh, but they were true. The brutal honesty of it was like a slap of cold water. He wasn't coddling her. He was telling her the truth of their situation. Crying wouldn't help. Fainting wouldn't help. Only moving would. She looked from his hard, determined face to the empty, shimmering horizon. He was right. He was the only thing she had. She nodded, taking a ragged breath, and started to run again. He set a punishing pace. Following the winding path of the dry riverbed, it offered the slightest bit of cover, keeping them below the level of the surrounding plain. He moved with a long, ground-eating stride, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead, looking for better cover, for any sign of water, for any advantage. He was a man in his element, as grim and efficient as the landscape itself. Ellie struggled to keep up. Her world narrowed to the sight of his back, the burning in her legs, and the desperate need for air. He didn't speak again, and she was grateful for it. Words were a waste of breath. All that mattered was putting one foot in front of the other. He had thrown her from a train, and now she was following him through hell, trusting him completely. The absurdity of it was lost in the desperate need for survival. After what felt like an hour, he finally pulled her into the shadow of a small rock outcropping. "Rest," he commanded, pushing her down onto the hot stone. Not for long. He pulled a small, metal canteen from inside his coat. He uncorked it and handed it to her. Just a sip. The water was warm, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She took a small swallow and handed it back. He took an equally small one himself before capping it. He looked back the way they had come. His eyes narrowed against the glare. And then they saw them. 3 figures, small and dark against the skyline, standing at the top of the embankment near the tracks. They were too far to make out clearly, but it was them. One of them pointed in their direction. A new wave of cold fear washed over Ellie, chilling her despite the heat. They had been found. "Move," Silas said, his voice a low growl. He pulled her up and pushed her forward, away from the rocks and deeper into a cluster of thick, thorny mesquite. The chase was on again. This time it was different. It was no longer a blind flight. It was a hunt. They could hear the men shouting in the distance, their voices carried on the dry wind. They scrambled over rocks, pushed through grasping branches that tore at their skin and clothes. Silas seemed to know where he was going, or at least he moved with a purpose that gave the illusion of a plan. He led her into a narrow, twisting canyon, its high walls offering shade and cover. They ran until Ellie's vision started to blur at the edges, until her legs were numb. Finally, Silas shoved her into a deep crevice between 2 massive boulders, a space barely big enough for both of them. He pressed in behind her, his body shielding the entrance. "Don't move, don't make a sound," he breathed into her hair. They stood in the suffocating, silent darkness, their bodies pressed together. Listening, they could hear the scrape of boots on gravel nearby. The voices were closer now, angry and frustrated. "They came this way, I saw them. It's a maze in here. Spread out, find them." Ellie held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure they could hear it. She could feel Silas's chest, pressed against her back, rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm. He was completely calm, a rock she could lean on, in the chaos and terror of the last few hours. This stranger had become her anchor. He had thrown himself through a window for her. He had shielded her with his body. He was leading her through a desert that should have killed her. He was no longer a stranger. He was the only person in the world. A shadow fell across the opening of their crevice. A man stood there, peering into the gloom. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the end. But the man just grunted, spat on the ground, and moved on. They waited in the silence, listening to the sounds of the search party fade as the men moved deeper into the canyon. For now, they were safe, bruised, bleeding, and exhausted, but safe. Silas didn't move away. He stayed where he was, a solid wall behind her, his breath warm on her neck. In the shared darkness of their hiding place, surrounded by a hostile world, a new, unspoken truth settled between them. The chase had ripped them from their separate lives and forged them into something else. They were no longer just a man and a girl. They were a unit of survival. They remained in the crevice long after the sounds of the men had faded. Two figures pressed into the earth's embrace. The sun bled out of the sky, and the sharp, defined shadows of the canyon softened into a uniform purple gloom. The oppressive heat of the day finally broke, replaced by the desert's sudden, chilling cold. It was a cold that seeped into the bones, a reminder that this land was as unforgiving in darkness as it was in light. Ellie's body had gone from trembling to numb. The adrenaline had leached away, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion and a gnawing hunger. She was aware of Silas behind her, a solid, warm presence. He hadn't moved, his breathing the only sound in their small sanctuary, a slow and steady rhythm that had become her only measure of time. Finally, when the sky was a black velvet blanket punctured by a million diamond-sharp stars, he shifted. "They're gone," he said, his voice a low rumble in the immense silence. "For now, we can't stay here." He backed out of the crevice, and Ellie stumbled after him into the open, her limbs stiff and clumsy. The night air was sharp in her lungs. The moon had risen, a silver disk that bathed the canyon in an ethereal, ghostly light, turning the red rocks into monuments of shadow and silver. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice barely a scratch of sound. "My place," he answered, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. He looked up at the stars, getting his bearings. "It's a ways yet, a hard walk." He looked at her then, his face half in shadow, the gash on his cheek a dark line. His eyes assessed her torn dress, her pale, dirt-streaked face, the tremor she couldn't control. "Think you can make it?" It wasn't a challenge, just a question, a practical matter. She thought of the men, of the train, of the life she had fled. The thought of going back was more terrifying than any hardship this desert could offer. "Yes," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. He gave a single, curt nod and set off, not down the canyon, but up a steep, treacherous trail of loose rock that Ellie could barely see. The journey was a silent, grueling ordeal. Silas moved with the sure-footedness of a man born to this terrain, his dark form a beacon for her to follow. He never got too far ahead, pausing on ridges to let her catch up, his silhouette a stark figure against the star-dusted sky. The world shrank to the scrape of her worn shoes on rock, the burn in her thighs, and the ragged sound of her own breathing. The desert at night was a different beast. It was alive with unseen things, the skitter of a lizard, the mournful cry of a distant coyote, the whisper of the wind over the rocks. It was vast and lonely. But for the first time, Ellie didn't feel threatened by the emptiness. With Silas leading the way, the emptiness felt clean, a blank slate where the horrors of her past couldn't find purchase. They walked for hours. When he saw her stumble one too many times, he stopped and gave her the last sip of water from the canteen. He didn't take any himself. The gesture was a silent acknowledgement, a bond forged in shared hardship. He was no longer just protecting her. He was providing for her. Just before dawn, when the eastern sky was beginning to soften from black to a bruised gray, he stopped on a low rise. "We're here," he said. Ellie followed his gaze. Below them, nestled in a shallow basin protected by low mesas, was a place that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. It wasn't much. A small cabin, built of sturdy, sun-bleached timber and adobe, with a stone chimney at one end. A simple corral made of weathered poles stood nearby, holding two sturdy-looking horses who flicked their tails in the pre-dawn stillness. There was a well with a wooden bucket, a small, struggling vegetable patch, and a lone, ancient cottonwood tree, its leaves whispering in the faint breeze. There were no fences marking a border, no grand gate. The ranch simply existed, a testament to one man's quiet defiance against the vast emptiness. It wasn't a fortress, but it felt like the safest place on earth. It was a place of profound peace. As they walked down the slope, the first rays of sun crested the mesas, spilling liquid gold across the land. The light touched the cabin, making the single glass-paned window gleam. A thin curl of smoke was rising from the chimney. The sight of the smoke made Silas pause. A flicker of something concern perhaps crossed his face before it was gone. As they drew closer, the cabin door opened. A boy stood there, small and wiry, with a shock of untamable brown hair and eyes that were too old for his young face. He couldn't have been more than 9. He held a wooden pail in one hand, clearly on his way to an early chore. He saw Silas, and his solemn face didn't register surprise, only a quiet acknowledgement. Then his eyes fell on Ellie, taking in her torn dress, her wild hair, and the exhaustion etched on her features. He didn't stare or point, he just watched, his gaze filled with a grave, silent curiosity. "Tom," Silas said. His voice, which had been so hard and spare, softened almost imperceptibly. "You're back," the boy stated. It wasn't a question. "I'm back," Silas confirmed. He stopped a few feet from the boy and gestured tiredly toward Ellie. "This is Ellie. She's had a rough time. She'll be staying with us for a while." He then looked at Ellie. "Ellie, this is Tom." The introduction was as spare as the landscape. No last names, no explanations. Tom looked at Ellie. His head tilted slightly. He gave a small, hesitant nod. Ellie, unsure of what to do, managed a weak smile. It felt foreign on her face. Tom seemed to accept her presence as he would a change in the weather, an unexpected event to be observed and adapted to. He turned his attention back to Silas. "Your cheek is bleeding," he said, his voice quiet, "and her dress is torn." "We fell," Silas said, the simple explanation covering a world of violence. He looked past Tom, into the warmth of the cabin. "Go on inside. Ellie, you can rest." She hesitated on the threshold. To step inside felt like crossing a line into a new life. The air from within smelled of coffee, bacon, and wood smoke. It was the smell of a home. She took the step. The inside was one main room, as simple and functional as the outside. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a rough-hewn wooden table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves holding a few tin plates and cups. Everything was clean, worn, and in its proper place. It was a space built for purpose, not for comfort, yet it was the most comforting place she had ever been. Silas directed her to a narrow door at the back. "You can take this room." It was little more than a closet, with a narrow cot built into the wall, a small crate for a bedside table, and a single peg on the wall for clothes. A small, high window looked out onto the empty land behind the cabin. It was stark, but it was hers. It was a room with a door she could close. "There's water in the pitcher," Silas said from the doorway. "Tom will bring you something to eat. Get some sleep." He pulled the door almost closed, leaving it cracked just enough for light to enter. A silent offer of privacy that she could accept or refuse. She heard his low voice in the other room, and Tom's quiet responses. She sat on the edge of the cot, the coarse blanket rough beneath her fingers. And then, the strength that had carried her through the last 24 hours finally deserted her. A great shuddering wave of relief washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She didn't cry. She was too empty for tears. She just sat there, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin, the crackle of the fire, the scrape of a pan, the murmur of a boy and a man who had somehow, against all odds, created a small pocket of peace in the middle of a brutal world. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock. Tom stood there, holding a tin plate with a piece of cornbread and bacon. He didn't enter the room, just held it out to her. His eyes met hers for a second, wide and serious, before he looked away at the floor. "Thank you, Tom," she whispered. He just nodded and scurried away, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Ellie ate slowly, deliberately, as if rediscovering the simple act of nourishment. Each bite was an anchor to this new reality. When she was done, she placed the plate on the crate and lay down on the cot. She didn't bother to remove her ruined shoes or wash her face. She simply closed her eyes. The world outside the cabin went on. The sun rose higher. The horses stamped in the corral. The wind sighed through the cottonwood leaves. But in her small, dark room, there was only silence. It was a silence that wasn't empty. It was full of safety. For the first time in years, Ellie wasn't listening for a footstep on the stair, for an angry voice, for the sound of danger. She was just listening to the quiet. She stood at the small window much later, watching the afternoon light paint the mesas in shades of orange and deep red. She saw Silas, his back to her, mending a strap on a saddle. She saw Tom, scattering feed for a few chickens she hadn't noticed before. They moved in a comfortable, practiced silence, each knowing their role, their presence a quiet reassurance to the other. They were a family, not one of blood, but one of necessity and quiet care, a broken man and a lost boy. And now, her, a girl who had been running so long she'd forgotten what it felt to stand still. She took a breath, a real one. It filled her lungs all the way to the bottom, without the familiar catch of fear in her throat. The air tasted of dust and sage and freedom. It wasn't the end of her fear. She knew. The men were still out there. Her past was not erased. But here, in this simple place carved out of the wilderness, she had a reprieve. She had a place to breathe. Days bled into one another, measured not by a calendar, but by the slow crawl of the sun across the immense, silent sky. Ellie's life found a rhythm, as quiet and steady as the drip of water into the basin at the dry sink. The terror of the chase receded, leaving behind a deep, abiding caution, like the memory of a burn on the skin. She learned the language of the ranch, a language spoken not with words, but with the rising of the sun, the creak of the well pump, and the soft nicker of horses at dusk. In this world of three, silence was the common tongue. Words were a currency they had little of, and what they had, they spent with care. Silas was the most frugal of all. He would leave at dawn, a silent figure melting into the vast landscape, and return at dusk, smelling of dust, leather, and horse. His presence was a solid, reassuring weight in the small cabin. He never asked her a single question about where she had come from or who she was running from. He did not pry into the shadowed corners of her past. This absence of curiosity was the greatest courtesy he could have paid her, a gift of anonymity that allowed her to simply be. Tom was the bridge between their two solitudes. He was a boy who had learned to live in the quiet. He would follow Silas through his chores, a small, serious shadow, and would sit with Ellie on the porch steps, showing her a curiously shaped rock or the feather of a hawk. His explanations whispered as if sharing a great secret. His presence filled the silence, not with a noise, but with a gentle, living warmth. Ellie found her place in the small, unspoken ways. No one told her what to do. She simply watched and learned and did what needed doing. She rose before the sun, long after Silas had already gone, and took over the small tasks Tom usually handled. She fed the chickens, her movements slow and careful so as not to startle them. She tended to the small vegetable patch, her fingers finding a strange comfort in the feel of the dry, warm earth. She swept the cabin floor, mended Tom's worn shirts with neat, tiny stitches, and learned to bake a dense, heavy cornbread that Silas and Tom would eat without comment, their clean plates the only praise she needed. Her life became a series of small, meaningful actions. She was paying her way not with money, but with care. The communication between her and Silas began as a series of gestures, as tentative and delicate as the first desert blooms after a rain. One afternoon, while drawing water from the well, she noticed a single, stubborn wildflower growing from a crack in the dry earth. It was a tiny thing of startling purple, a splash of defiant life against the endless shades of brown and gray. She picked it carefully and brought it inside, placing it in a cup of water on the main table. That evening, Silas came in, weary from a long day. He saw the flower immediately. It was the only thing in the Spartan room that was not strictly necessary. His eyes lingered on it for a long moment. He didn't look at her or acknowledge the gesture in any way. But later, after she and Tom had gone to their beds, she peered through a crack in her door and saw him in the lamplight. He took the small flower from the cup, blotted it gently on a rag, and opened the worn, leather-bound book he sometimes read. He carefully placed the blossom between 2 pages and closed the book, pressing the small piece of life into his memory. A few days later, the afternoon heat was a stifling blanket. Ellie sat on the edge of the porch, trying to find a breath of air in the shade of the roof. Silas rode in, dismounted, and led his horse to the trough. He pumped water until it was overflowing, then worked the pump again, letting the cool, clear water run over his own head and dusty hands. He took a long drink from the tin dipper, and then, without looking at her, he filled it again. He walked over to the porch and set the dipper on the railing a few feet from where she sat before turning to unsaddle his horse. The dipper was a silent offering, cool water, freely given. She picked it up, the metal cold against her fingers. She drank, the water soothing her parched throat. Across the dusty yard, he glanced over his shoulder, and for a second, their eyes met. It was a fleeting look, devoid of any specific emotion. Yet it was a moment of profound connection, a shared understanding of a simple, desperate need relief from the heat, a moment of reprieve. They learned each other's habits. She learned that he took his coffee black and strong. The next morning, a cup was waiting on the table when he came in from the corral. He learned that she was light-footed and easily startled by sudden noises. He took to stamping the dust from his boots on the porch step before entering the cabin, a soft thunder that always announced his arrival. Tom thrived in the quiet space Ellie's presence had created. She taught him how to read letters from an old primer she'd found tucked on a shelf. They would sit together, her finger tracing the words, his small voice sounding them out in a soft murmur. Silas would often watch them from the doorway, his face unreadable in the shadows, as the boy who had never known a mother's care learned at the knee of a girl who seemed to be rediscovering her own gentle nature. Silas's unspoken trust in her with the boy was perhaps the most significant gesture of all. He was entrusting her with the only other person in his world. One evening, as the air grew cool, Ellie saw Silas sitting on the hard bench outside, meticulously cleaning a rifle in the fading light. His focus was absolute. She noticed the way he shifted now and then, trying to get comfortable on the unforgiving wood. She went back inside, took a spare, threadbare quilt from a chest, and folded it into a thick cushion. She walked outside, her steps soft in the dust. He didn't look up from his work as she approached. She said nothing, simply placed the folded quilt on the bench beside him and returned to the cabin. For a full minute, he didn't move. He continued to oil the rifle's mechanism with steady, practiced hands. Then, slowly, he slid over, settling his weight onto the soft cushion she had made. The small sigh of comfort he released was almost inaudible, but to Ellie, listening from just inside the door, it was as loud as a declaration. Trust was being built, not with promises or confessions, but with these small, quiet acts of care. It was a delicate architecture of gestures, a foundation laid one silent offering at a time. They were two people scarred by the world, wary of the promises that words could make and break. They had found a safer language, one that could not lie. A cup of water was just a cup of water. A mended shirt was just a mended shirt. But in the vast silence of their lives, these small, tangible things became everything. They were apologies, thank yous, and promises, all without the risk of a single spoken word. One afternoon, she found his duster, the heavy coat she had hidden beneath on the train, slung over a chair. It was caked with dust, and she noticed a long, L-shaped tear in the fabric near the hem, likely from their tumble down the embankment. She took it to her room, with a needle and thread from her small carpet bag. She sat on her cot and began to sew. Her stitches were small and even, a neat, dark line against the faded canvas. She wasn't just mending a piece of cloth. She was mending a memory, smoothing over the jagged edges of a terrifying day with a quiet, patient act of restoration. She finished as dusk was falling, folding the coat carefully and placing it on the chair where she had found it. She went about her evening tasks, helping Tom set the table for their simple supper. Silas came in, his movements heavy with the day's labor. He stopped when he saw the coat. He walked over to it and picked it up, his gaze falling immediately on the mended tear. He ran his thumb over the line of her stitches, the calloused, rough skin a contrast to the delicate work. He stood like that for a long time, his back to her. Then he turned. He looked across the room at her, where she stood by the fire, a wooden spoon in her hand. He didn't smile. His face remained a mask of weary endurance. But his eyes, for the first time, held a different light. The guarded, watchful hardness was gone, replaced by something softer, something that acknowledged her, truly saw her, not as a piece of trouble he'd been saddled with, but as the person who had mended his coat. Ellie met his gaze, her heart giving a slow, heavy beat. In the quiet cabin, with the fire crackling between them, a silent contract was sealed. No words were spoken, but both of them knew. They were learning to trust. The peace of the ranch was a fragile thing, a glass held in a steady hand. For a few precious weeks, the hand had not trembled. The world had shrunk to the small basin, to the rhythm of chores and the quiet companionship of three solitary souls. The past was a ghost, a bad dream that faded with the morning sun. But ghosts have a way of finding you, and the teeth of the past are long and sharp. It happened on a day like any other, under a sky of pale, cloudless blue. The heat was a dry, steady pressure. Ellie was hanging washed clothes on a line stretched between the cabin and the cottonwood tree. The damp fabric was cool against her fingers, and the simple, repetitive motion was calming. Tom was a few yards away, in the shade of the corral, meticulously building a small fortress out of twigs and stones, his face a mask of concentration. The world was blessedly, beautifully normal. The sound came first, a distant, rhythmic drumming that was not the sound of a lone rider. It was the sound of several horses, pushed hard. Ellie froze, a clothespin in her hand, her head cocked, her heart, which had learned to beat at a slow, steady rhythm, gave a sudden, sick lurch. Tom looked up from his work, his brow furrowed. Silas emerged from the small barn, a bridle in his hand. He had heard it too. He stood for a moment, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on the low rise to the east where the trail to their basin began. The drumming grew louder, closer. It was the sound of doom. "Tom!" Silas's voice was low, but it cut through the air with an edge of cold steel. "Inside, now!" He didn't look at the boy, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "Ellie, get in the cabin. Bolt the door." Tom scrambled to his feet, his fortress forgotten, and ran for the cabin, his small face pale with confusion and fear. Ellie stood paralyzed for a second, the wet shirt still clutched in her hand. Then the riders appeared. 3 of them, dark silhouettes cresting the rise, their horses kicking up plumes of dust. The men from the train. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the shirt and ran for the cabin, her feet stumbling in the dust. She shoved Tom inside ahead of her and slammed the heavy wooden door, ramming the thick iron bolt into place just as Silas reached the porch. "Stay away from the window," he commanded through the door, his voice tight. He didn't wait for a reply. She heard the scrape of his boots as he moved to the corner of the porch, taking up a defensive position. Inside, the cabin was suddenly dark and suffocating. Ellie pulled Tom into her arms, pressing his face into her skirt so he wouldn't see. She could feel the boy's small body trembling. She peered through a tiny crack in the wooden shutters, her own heart hammering against her ribs. The 3 riders slowed to a walk as they entered the yard, fanning out in a half circle. The man in the middle, a big bearded man with a cruel twist to his mouth, was the one who had spoken on the train. He grinned, a humorless baring of teeth. "Well, look what we have here," he called out, his voice thick with malicious satisfaction. "A little hideaway. You led us a merry chase. Cowpoke." Silas stood by the porch post, his hands empty and visible at his sides. He was perfectly still, his body radiating a lethal calm. "You're on private land," he said, his voice flat. "State your business and ride out." "Our business is with the girl," the man sneered. "The one you helped steal. Send her out, and we'll leave you to your dirt patch." "There's no girl here," Silas lied, his voice like stone. The man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Don't play dumb. We tracked you from the town you left 2 days before you got on that train. We know she's with you. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard." He dismounted, as did the other 2 men, their movements slow and deliberate. They were confident. They were predators who had cornered their prey. "I'm telling you one last time," Silas said, his voice dropping lower. "Ride out." The man gave a signal, a slight flick of his head, and then the world erupted. One of the men lunged for Silas, while the other 2 charged the cabin. Silas moved with a speed that was shocking. He met the first man's charge, his fist connecting with a crack of bone on jaw that sent the man staggering back. But the other 2 were already on the porch. The cabin door shuddered as a heavy boot slammed against it. The bolt held. Ellie screamed as another kick splintered the wood near the latch. Tom whimpered in her arms. Outside, the fight was a whirlwind of brutal, desperate motion. Silas was a force of nature, using his size and strength to hold his ground against the 2 men who now turned on him. He fought with a grim, silent efficiency, his fists like hammers. But it was 2 against 1. While he was occupied with one, the other swung the butt of his rifle in a vicious arc. The heavy wood connected with the side of Silas's head with a sickening thud. He grunted, his knees buckling, and pitched forward into the dust. He didn't move. No, Ellie's scream was a raw, ragged tear in the air. The men laughed. The bearded leader walked over to Silas's still form and nudged him with his boot. "Tougher than he looks." Not tough enough. He turned his cold eyes to the cabin door. "Now, for the girl." They threw their shoulders against the door. The wood groaned, splintered, and then the bolt ripped free from the frame. The door flew open, slamming against the inside wall. The 3 men filled the doorway, blocking out the light, their menacing shapes making the small room shrink. Ellie scrambled backward, pulling Tom with her, until her back was against the stone of the fireplace. Her mind was a whiteout of pure terror. This was it, the end of her running. The bearded man's eyes roamed over her, a possessive, triumphant glare. "There you are, little bird. Time to come home." He took a step into the room. And then Tom, in a surge of desperate courage, wrenched himself from Ellie's grasp. "Leave her alone," he yelled, his small voice piping but full of fury. He threw himself at the man's legs, pounding on his thigh with his small fists. The man looked down, his expression one of surprised annoyance. He backhanded the boy, a casual, contemptuous blow that sent Tom sprawling to the floor. That single act of cruelty broke through Ellie's paralysis. A hot, white rage she had never known she possessed surged through her. It was one thing for them to come for her. It was another to harm this child, this innocent. As the men's attention was on the sobbing boy, Ellie's eyes darted around the room. They fell upon the rifle. Silas's rifle. It was leaning against the wall by the fireplace, right where he always kept it, the rifle he had cleaned so carefully. She moved without thinking. In 2 steps, she had it in her hands. It was heavier than she had imagined, the wood smooth and cool, the metal smelling of oil and power. She raised it, the long barrel wavering. The men turned, their laughter dying in their throats. They saw the girl, her face pale as a sheet, her eyes blazing with a desperate fire, and the rifle pointed unsteadily at them. The bearded man recovered first. He let out a disbelieving laugh. "You gonna shoot me with that, girl? You don't have the nerve." He was right. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the weapon. Her finger was on the trigger, but she couldn't make it move. Fear was a cold hand, squeezing the courage from her heart. Then, one of the other men, seeing his chance, moved with snake-like speed. He lunged for Tom, grabbing him and hauling him to his feet. He pulled a long knife from his belt and held the blade to the boy's throat. "Drop the gun," the man hissed, his face contorted in a snarl. "Drop it now, or the kid pays the price." Tom let out a terrified cry. The sight of the gleaming steel against the boy's skin, the sound of his fear, it shattered the last of Ellie's hesitation. The world narrowed to that single, horrific image. The boy she had taught to read, the boy who had brought her food, the boy who was the closest thing to a son Silas had. The love she felt for these 2 people, a love that had grown in silence and gestures, now roared to life. It was a fierce, protective inferno that burned away every last shred of her fear. Her hand stopped shaking. Her grip on the rifle tightened. Her gaze became sharp and focused. She was no longer a girl running. She was a woman defending her home. She leveled the rifle at the man holding Tom. Her voice, when it came, was not her own. It was low, steady, and deadly calm. "Let him go." The bearded man laughed. "She's bluffing." "I am not," Ellie said, her eyes locked on the man with the knife. "I will shoot you! I will!" A deafening boom suddenly echoed from outside, a sound that was not a rifle shot. It was the deep-throated roar of a shotgun. One of the men, the bearded leader who was still standing in the yard, cried out and crumpled to the ground. Everyone froze. The 2 men inside the cabin stared in disbelief. From the edge of the property, a figure emerged from the shimmering heat. It was an old man, his back bent with age, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He was carrying a long, double-barreled shotgun, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from one of the barrels. It was Raoul, a grizzled old farmer whose small spread was a few miles away, the only other soul for a day's ride in any direction. He was a man Silas sometimes traded with, a man of few words and even fewer visits. I heard shouting. Raoul called out, his voice a gravelly rasp that carried easily in the still air. He calmly broke the shotgun, ejected the spent shell, and slid a new one into place with a practiced click that sounded as loud as a thunderclap. "Seems to me you boys are trespassing, and I don't take kindly to men who threaten children." The man holding Tom stared, his mind racing. His partner was down. An old man with a shotgun was outside, and a girl with a rifle and a killer's look in her eye was inside. The odds had changed. He made his decision. He shoved Tom away from him, sending the boy stumbling toward Ellie. In the same motion, he turned and bolted out the back of the cabin, crashing through the small, flimsy door and disappearing into the brush. His companion, seeing his chance, followed suit, scrambling out the main door and running for his life. Raoul didn't fire again. He just watched them go, his expression grim. The sudden silence was deafening. Ellie stood for a moment, the heavy rifle still in her hands. Then, her strength gave out. The rifle clattered to the floor. Tom ran to her, burying his face in her skirt, his small body racked with sobs. She sank to her knees, wrapping her arms around him, holding him tight. She looked past him, through the open door. Silas was still unconscious in the dust. The other man lay unmoving in the yard. The sun beat down. The world was broken, but they were alive. She held the weeping boy, the protector now, in the ruins of their quiet life. The roar of the shotgun faded, leaving a silence that was heavier and more terrible than the noise it had replaced. For a heartbeat, the world was a frozen tableau, the dust settling in the yard. The still forms of the two men, the weeping boy clinging to the girl, and the old man with the smoking gun. Then the spell broke. Ellie's gaze snapped from the running men to the figure lying motionless in the dirt. "Silas!" She pushed Tom gently behind her. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She rose to her feet and walked on unsteady legs out of the cabin and into the brutal afternoon sun. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch, afraid of what she might find. His face was slack, unnaturally pale beneath the dust and blood. A dark, ugly bruise was swelling on the side of his head where the rifle butt had struck him. Raoul came shuffling over, his shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. He knelt on his good knee, his old eyes taking in the scene with a grim, practiced air. "Let's see the damage," he grunted. He gently prodded Silas's neck. "He's alive. Breathing is shallow, but steady." That was a bad blow to the head. Together, they managed to get him inside. He was a dead weight, his long limbs uncooperative. They laid him on his own cot, which seemed too small to contain his frame. Tom watched from the corner, his eyes wide and dark, his small hands clenched into fists. "The other one," Ellie started, her voice barely a whisper, looking toward the man Raoul had shot. "He won't be bothering anyone again," Raoul said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "I'll take care of it. And the horses they left. You've got enough to worry about right here." He looked from Silas's unconscious form to Ellie's pale face. "Keep a cool cloth on his head for the fever. If he wakes, try to get some water in him. The rest is up to God and a strong constitution." He put a gnarled, heavy hand on her shoulder for a moment. "You did good, girl. You stood your ground." Then he was gone, leaving them alone in the wreckage of their peace. The sun began to set, and the shadows that filled the cabin felt long and cold. A fever, just as Raoul had predicted, began to set in. Silas's skin grew hot to the touch, and a restless delirium took hold of him. He would mutter broken phrases, words without meaning, and his limbs would twitch. The strong, silent man who had been her rock was gone, replaced by a fragile, broken stranger. And in that moment, something inside Ellie shifted. The instinct to run, the impulse that had been her constant companion for years, simply vanished. It was not a conscious decision. The thought of leaving this place, of leaving him in this state, was an impossibility, like trying to fly. Her world, which had once been a terrifyingly wide expanse to flee across, had shrunk to the four walls of this cabin, to the narrow space of this cot. She was no longer running from anything. She was staying for someone. Her vigil began. She became a creature of instinct and necessity. She found she had a reserve of strength she never knew she possessed. With Tom as her small, silent helper, she fell into a routine born of desperation. The first night was the worst. The fever raged, and Silas thrashed against the damp cloth she laid on his forehead. She sat on a small stool beside him, dipping the rags into a basin of cool well water again and again, the rhythmic motion the only thing keeping her own panic at bay. Every rasp of his breath, every low groan that escaped his lips, was a new torment. Tom, refusing to go to his own bed, curled up in a blanket on the floor in the corner, a small, sleeping guardian. For 3 days, the world did not exist outside that room. Ellie dozed in the chair, waking at the slightest sound. She forgot to eat until Tom would appear at her elbow, silently holding out a piece of cornbread or a cup of milk. They worked together in their shared, quiet language. When she needed more water, he would fetch it. When the bloody rags needed washing, he would take them to the basin. They were a team, bound by their shared love for the man on the cot. On the second day, the silence in the room became unbearable, a heavy shroud that seemed to suffocate her. She looked around, desperate for something to fill it, something to fight back the fear. Her eyes fell on the primer she and Tom had been using for his lessons. She picked it up, her hands trembling slightly. She pulled her stool closer to the cot and, in a low, soft voice, she began to read. A is for apple, B is for boy. The simple, childish words felt absurd, yet the sound of her own voice in the quiet room was a comfort. She read through the whole book, her voice growing steadier with each page. She wasn't sure if he could hear her. It didn't matter. She was speaking for him, for herself, for Tom, a small act of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. She was keeping the darkness at bay with the alphabet. Time lost its meaning. There was only the cycle of light and dark outside the window, the heat of his skin, and the endless task of her care. In moments of quiet, when he was still, she would find herself just watching him. She studied his face. The hard lines softened in his unconscious state. She looked at his hands, lying limp on the blanket, the hands that had pulled her from the train, that were calloused from work and scarred by life. On the third night, her own exhaustion nearly overwhelmed her. The fear that he might not wake up, that he might just slip away from them in this quiet room, became a physical ache in her chest. She felt a wave of despair so profound it made her dizzy. Unthinkingly, she reached out and took his hand. His skin was hot and dry. His fingers, which she had imagined would be strong enough to crush her own, lay unresponsive in her small grasp. She held on, closing her eyes, her head bowed. It was a silent prayer, a desperate plea to whatever powers governed life and death. She held on as if she could anchor him to the world through her touch alone, as if she could pour her own strength, her own will to live, into him. She must have drifted off like that, slumped in the chair, her hand still holding his. She was woken by a change, a subtle shift in the room. She opened her eyes. The first pale light of dawn was filtering through the window. The cabin was still. She looked at Silas. The restless energy was gone. He was lying perfectly still. A new, terrifying fear seized her. Had he? She put her hand to his forehead. It was still warm, but the raging, unnatural heat was gone. The fever had broken. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her lips, a sound that was half choke, half laugh. She stayed like that, watching him as the sun rose higher. His breathing was deeper now, more even. The lines of pain on his face seemed to have eased. He was no longer fighting. He was healing. Later that morning, as she was bathing his face with a fresh cloth, his eyelids flickered. Her breath caught in her throat. She stopped, her hand hovering in the air. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, slowly opened. They were clouded with confusion at first, unfocused. They roamed the ceiling, the walls, and then they found her. They rested on her face. There was a long, silent moment where he just looked at her. He saw the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the fierce, unwavering concern in her gaze. His lips, cracked and dry, parted slightly. No sound came out. He tried to lift his hand, the one she had held through the night. It barely moved. Ellie saw the effort, the flicker of frustration in his eyes. She gently took his hand in both of hers again, her touch infinitely soft. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe. Just rest." A flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. His gaze held hers, and in that look, 1,000 unspoken words were exchanged. He saw not the frightened girl from the train, but a woman who had stood her ground, who had faced down monsters for him, who had nursed him back from the brink. And she saw not the invincible, stoic cowboy, but a man, vulnerable and broken, who had needed her. He couldn't speak, but his fingers, which had been so limp before, gave the faintest, almost imperceptible squeeze against hers. It was a tremor of a movement. But for Ellie, it was as powerful as a shout. It was acknowledgement. It was gratitude. It was a connection forged in the crucible of violence and tempered in the quiet crucible of care. The dust had settled, and in its place, something new and incredibly strong had begun to grow. Healing is a quiet business. It does not happen in a sudden, dramatic flash, but in the slow, incremental passage of days, in the patient knitting together of flesh and spirit. For the 3 souls in the small cabin, recovery was a shared journey, a silent conspiracy against the wounds the world had dealt them. Silas's strength returned at a frustratingly slow pace. He, who had measured his worth by the work of his hands and the strength of his back, was now confined to a chair on the porch, his world reduced to the small square of dusty ground in front of him. The head wound left him prone to dizzy spells, and a deep, bone-weary weakness clung to him like a second skin. For a man who had never accepted help from anyone, this forced dependency was a special kind of torment, but it was also a kind of medicine. A new routine settled over the ranch, dictated by Silas's limitations. Ellie became the quiet center of their universe. She rose before the sun, her movements sure and steady, and the cabin became her domain. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended her small garden with a fierce devotion. Her hands, once soft and uncertain, became capable and calloused. She learned the rhythms of the land, the language of the wind, and the weight of a full water bucket. Tom, in the absence of Silas's full strength, grew in stature and responsibility. He took on more of the outdoor chores, feeding the horses and checking the perimeter with a seriousness that was both touching and heartbreaking. He was no longer just a boy being cared for. He was a vital part of their collective survival. They became a unit, a 3-legged stool that could only stand by leaning on one another. The work of the ranch was done together. When a sack of flour proved too heavy for Ellie to lift onto the shelf, Silas would rise slowly from his chair, his hand braced against the wall, and provide the extra strength needed to hoist it into place. When a stubborn calf refused to return to the corral, Tom would run it toward the gate while Ellie waved a blanket, their coordinated efforts achieving what neither could do alone. These small, shared victories were the mortar that bound them together. Mealtimes, once a functional and mostly silent affair, became a sacred ritual. They would gather around the small table as the sun went down, the flickering lamplight casting warm shadows on their faces. Words were still sparse, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the wary silence of strangers, but the comfortable, breathing silence of family. It was filled with the small sounds of contentment, the clink of forks on tin plates, Tom's sigh as he ate, the quiet chewing of a shared meal earned through a shared day's work. In this quiet space, their deeper wounds began to heal. Ellie, who had spent years looking over her shoulder, finally stopped. The act of caring for Silas, of being needed so completely, had anchored her. She had been the one to stand, the one to hold things together. The terror of her past hadn't disappeared, but its power over her had diminished. It was a distant storm now, its thunder muffled by the steady, reassuring rhythms of her new life. One afternoon, she was watching Tom try to teach a stray dog he'd found to shake hands. The dog, a scruffy collection of bones and fur, would only lick the boy's outstretched hand, wagging its tail furiously. Tom would sigh with exaggerated patience, then try again. A sound bubbled up in Ellie's throat, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. It was a laugh, not a loud one, just a soft, breathy chuckle. But it was genuine. From his chair on the porch, Silas heard it. He turned his head slowly and watched her, a small, true smile gracing her lips as she watched the boy and his new friend. A warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. It was like seeing the first flower after a long, hard winter. He realized he had never heard her laugh before. The sound was a kind of miracle. His own healing was more than just physical, forced into stillness. Silas had no choice but to watch, to observe. He watched Ellie move through the day, her quiet competence a constant source of wonder. He saw the way she brushed the hair from Tom's forehead, the gentleness in her touch. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she mended his shirt, her stitches small and perfect. He had brought her here to hide her from the world, but in doing so, he had brought a quiet light into his own shadowed life. The walls he had built around his heart, walls erected by loss and hardship long ago, had begun to crumble without him even noticing. He had taken Tom in out of a sense of grim duty, providing for the boy's needs but keeping an emotional distance. He had offered Ellie his coat out of a fleeting, protective instinct. He had expected nothing from either of them, but they had given him something he hadn't known he was missing. One evening, Tom fell asleep on the floor, his head pillowed on the new dog's flank. Silas, feeling stronger than he had in weeks, rose from his chair. He walked over and, with a gentleness that would have been unthinkable a month ago, he stooped down and lifted the boy into his arms. Tom murmured in his sleep, his small arm wrapping around Silas's neck. Silas held him for a moment, looking down at the child's trusting, peaceful face. He carried him to his cot and laid him down, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin. It was the first time he had ever done so. As he stood there, looking at the boy, he felt a fierce, protective surge of something that felt dangerously like a father's love. He turned and saw Ellie standing in the doorway to her room, watching him. She said nothing, but her eyes were shining in the lamplight. In her gaze, he saw an understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the profound change that had taken place. They were no longer just three survivors sharing a roof. They were a family, forged in the absence of a name for what they were. The days grew shorter, the nights grew cooler. Silas was strong enough to work again, but he moved differently now. He no longer disappeared into the landscape alone. Sometimes Tom would trail him, asking 1,000 questions that Silas would answer with uncharacteristic patience. Sometimes he would find a reason to work near the cabin, mending a fence or fixing the corral gate, his presence a quiet orbit around the home they had built. One evening, all three of them sat on the porch, watching the sun set. The sky was a riot of orange, pink, and purple, a spectacle of impossible beauty. Tom was leaning against Silas's knee, tracing patterns in the dust with a stick. Ellie was beside him, shelling beans into a large wooden bowl, her hands moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. A comfortable silence enveloped them. It was a silence full of everything they couldn't say. It was full of gratitude, of shared history, of a deep and abiding sense of peace. They were three broken people who, together, had somehow become whole. Ellie looked up from her work, a soft smile on her lips, and met Silas's gaze. He didn't look away. He held her gaze, and for the first time, he let himself feel the simple, uncomplicated warmth of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He was learning that a man could be strong not just by standing alone, but by allowing himself a place to belong. The seasons began to turn in the high desert, a slow, subtle shift that only those who lived close to the land would notice. The relentless white heat of summer softened, and the sun's glare became more golden, less punishing. The air in the mornings held a new, sharp clarity, and the nights carried the first hint of a chill that spoke of the coming cold. The land itself seemed to take a long, slow breath, settling into a state of weary grace. Life on the ranch had found its own grace. The violent intrusion of the past had paradoxically, cemented their bond, transforming their cautious arrangement into something solid and real. The quiet rhythm they had established before was now deeper, imbued with an unspoken tenderness. They moved around each other with the easy, predictive grace of people who understood one another on a level far deeper than words. Love, in this quiet place, was not a sudden fire. It was a slow-growing thing, like the hardy plants that pushed their way through the rocky soil. It was in the way Silas would now instinctively look for Ellie first when he rode into the yard, a silent accounting that she was safe. It was in the way she would set aside a portion of the stew for him, knowing he would be late and hungry after a long day's work. It was in the way Tom would take both their hands, one in each of his, when they walked, a small, trusting bridge between their two worlds. One afternoon, Ellie and Tom ventured further than usual, following a dry wash in search of late-season berries. The land was stark, a study in rock and thorny brush, but in a place that should have been barren, sheltered from the wind in a deep fissure between two massive red rocks. They found an impossible patch of life. A cluster of wildflowers was growing there, their delicate, bell-shaped blossoms a startling shade of deep blue against the rust-colored stone. They were not beautiful in the manner of a garden rose. They were tough, wiry things, their stems thin but strong, their roots finding purchase in the barest suggestion of soil. They were a miracle of resilience. Tom let out a whoop of delight, but Ellie just stood there, mesmerized. The flowers were a perfect symbol of their lives, something fragile and beautiful that had managed to bloom in the hardest of places, not in spite of the harshness, but because of it. She knelt and, with great care, picked a single stem. It felt delicate and alive in her hand. She carried it all the way back to the cabin, protecting the fragile petals from the wind. Silas was in the corral, replacing a worn shoe on one of the horses. He was bent to his work, the setting sun casting his long shadow across the yard. The rhythmic clang of his hammer on the anvil was a steady, reassuring sound, the heartbeat of the ranch. He finished his work and straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. As he turned, he saw her standing there, waiting patiently. She walked toward him, holding out the flower. "I found this," she said, her voice soft. "It was growing in the rocks. It made me think of, well, it just seemed like it belonged here." Her words were simple, but they were laden with a meaning that hung in the quiet air between them. He looked down at the small, perfect blossom, its blue so deep it was almost purple. He saw its delicate form and its tenacious stem. He understood what she wasn't saying. It was fragile, but it was a survivor, like her, like them. His calloused, blacksmith's fingers, which could be so strong and rough, were impossibly gentle as he took the flower from her. He held it for a moment, his gaze moving from the blossom to her face, her eyes shining in the golden light. A current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had survived and everything they had become. There was no need for thanks. The gesture of giving and the act of receiving were a complete conversation. He turned and carried the flower into the cabin as if it were a precious treasure. Ellie watched him go, a quiet, profound happiness settling in her heart. Later that night, long after Tom and Ellie had gone to bed, Silas sat at the small table in the flickering lamplight. He unlocked a small wooden chest where he kept his important papers and took out a thin, leather-bound book. It was not a diary for his thoughts. It was a journal, a stark, practical log of his life. The entries were brief, factual. March 10th, fixed fence line at North Pasture. Weather clear. April 2nd, branded 10 new calves. Lost one to a coyote. June 18th, rode to town for supplies. Flour, salt, nails. He opened the book to a clean page. With the same care he had shown taking it from her hand, he laid the blue wildflower on the paper. He then found the page where, weeks ago, he had pressed the first small purple flower she had left for him. It was faded now, a delicate, papery ghost, but it was still there, a small, secret mark of beauty amidst the harsh accounting of his days. He placed the new flower several pages on, another marker in time, another testament to her presence in his life. He closed the book gently, the weight of the pages pressing the delicate life within, preserving it against time and decay. It was a secret act of reverence, a quiet man's only way of saying, "This matters. You matter." Their unspoken love manifested in 100 small ways in the days that followed. It became a language of touch, of nearness. While working together in the small kitchen, his arm would brush against hers, and instead of pulling away, the contact would linger for a moment. A brief, warm pressure that said more than a page of poetry. He took to teaching her how to handle a gun, not the heavy rifle she had wielded in desperation, but a smaller pistol. His hands would cover hers, showing her how to grip it, how to aim. His touch was practical, instructional, yet it was an intimacy that made her heart beat faster. He was giving her the tools to protect herself, an act of supreme trust and care. His low voice in her ear was a calm murmur, and she found herself focusing more on his nearness than on the target. One cool evening, they sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The silence was vast, stretching from them to the distant, dark mesas. Tom had already fallen asleep. Ellie shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter, without a word. Silas rose and went inside. He returned with his heavy duster, the one she had mended, the one she had hidden beneath. He draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was familiar, but the feeling was entirely different. It was no longer a shield to hide behind, but an embrace. It smelled of him of leather and dust and the faint, clean scent of sage. She pulled it closer, enveloped in its warmth, and leaned her head back against the porch post, her shoulder just barely touching his. He didn't move away. They sat like that for a long time, two small figures against the immense, star-dusted darkness, sharing a silent, perfect peace. Their love was like that night vast, quiet, and lit by a million tiny points of light that needed no explanation. It was a truth that was felt, not spoken. It had found its home in the space between glances, in the warmth of a shared coat, in the tender preservation of a wildflower that had no business growing in the desert at all. The high desert autumn settled in, painting the mornings with a brittle, silver frost and staining the leaves of the lone cottonwood, a brilliant, defiant yellow. The world seemed to hold its breath, poised between the fading memory of summer's heat and the coming bite of winter. Inside the small cabin, a deep and abiding peace had taken root. The quiet rhythms of their life together had become as natural and constant as the turning of the seasons. It was a life built of small, solid things. The smell of coffee and wood smoke in the morning, the shared work of preparing for winter, stacking firewood and preserving the last of the garden's bounty, the sound of Tom's careful voice as he read aloud to Ellie in the evenings, his progress a source of quiet pride for all of them, the comfortable silence that fell between her and Silas as they sat on the porch, watching the stars blaze in the cold, clear night. The past was a scar, healed over, no longer an open wound. The storm, when it returned, did not come with the thunder of a posse, but with the chilling quiet of a single rider. He appeared in the late afternoon, a dark speck on the eastern horizon, growing steadily larger. Ellie was the first to see him. She was returning from the well, a heavy bucket in each hand, when she saw the figure moving with a slow, deliberate pace that was somehow more menacing than a full-out gallop. It was not the shuffling gait of a prospector or the easy lope of a traveling cowboy. This man rode with a purpose. A cold dread, a feeling she had almost forgotten, washed over her. Her hands went numb, and the bucket slipped from her grasp, sloshing water onto the thirsty ground. For a single, paralyzing moment, she was the girl on the train again, her only instinct to turn, to run, to disappear. The cabin, which had become her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. Silas was by the corral, checking a loose post. He saw the spilled water, saw the rigid set of her shoulders, and followed her gaze to the approaching rider. His face, which had softened so much in these peaceful months, hardened into the impassive mask she remembered. He dropped his tools and began to walk toward her, his stride unhurried but resolute. Tom, who had been playing nearby, saw the change in both of them and ran to Ellie's side, his small hand instinctively finding hers. The instinct to flee was a physical thing, a scream in her throat. She could grab Tom, run to the back of the cabin, and disappear into the canyons. Silas would hold the man off. He would protect them. But as that thought crossed her mind, another, stronger one took its place. She was tired of running. She was tired of hiding behind him. This was her home. This was her family. This ghost was from her past, and she would face it. She took a deep, shaky breath and forced her feet to remain rooted to the ground. Her hand, which Tom was clutching, was trembling, but she squeezed his back, a small reassurance. Silas did not step in front of her. He came and stood beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. He did not reach for the pistol at his hip. He simply stood with her, a silent, solid presence. They were no longer a protector and a refugee. They were partners, facing the threat as one, seeing their unity. Tom straightened his small shoulders and stood a little taller, his grip on her hand tightening. They were a line, a small, defiant wall of three against the encroaching darkness. The rider came to a halt 20 yards from them. He was not one of the rough men from before. This man was dressed in a fine, dark coat, his hat clean, his boots polished. His face was pale and thin, with cold, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He looked like a man from the city, a crow in a land of hawks. He surveyed the simple ranch, his lips twisting in a faint, contemptuous sneer. Then his eyes settled on Ellie. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was quiet, cultured, yet it carried an unmistakable chill. The sound of her full name, a name she hadn't heard in years, was like a slap. "You have caused a great deal of trouble, a great deal of expense. He is not a patient man." Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew who he was. He was the lawyer, the facilitator, the man who cleaned up the messes for the powerful man she had escaped. He was more dangerous than a dozen thugs with guns. "There's no one by that name here," Silas said, his voice a low growl. The man's cold eyes flickered to Silas for a moment, dismissing him as little more than a piece of the landscape. "I am not here to speak with you, rancher. My business is with the girl." He looked back at Ellie, his smile thin and cruel. "He wants you to come back. He is willing to forgive your indiscretion. You know what will happen if you refuse. You know he does not like to be denied." It was the same threat, the same invisible chain she had been running from her entire life. It was a threat built on power, wealth, and the utter certainty that she was a possession, a thing to be retrieved. In the past, that certainty had been enough to send her fleeing in terror. She felt the tremor in her hands, the familiar ice of fear in her veins. But then she felt the solid warmth of Silas beside her, the trusting weight of Tom's hand in hers. She looked at the small, sturdy cabin behind them, at the lone yellowing cottonwood, at the vast, open sky. She had built a life here. She had found a home. She had found love, and she would not let it be taken from her. She met the man's cold gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the whisper of a frightened girl, but the clear, steady tone of a woman who knew her own mind. "My name is Ellie," she said, "and I am not going anywhere. This is my home." The man's thin smile faltered. He had expected tears, pleading, terror. He had not expected this quiet, unshakable resolve. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw that the frightened, pliable girl he had been sent to retrieve was gone. In her place stood a woman with eyes that, while still holding the memory of fear, were no longer ruled by it. His gaze shifted to Silas. He saw the cowboy, standing not as a guard, but as an equal, his unwavering support a palpable force. He saw the boy clutching the woman's hand, his small face a mask of fierce loyalty. He was a man who understood power, and he recognized it here. It was not the power of money or violence, but a different, more stubborn kind. It was the power of a bond that could not be easily broken. He had come to pluck a stray lamb from the wilderness, only to find she was protected by a small, resolute pack. He could press the issue. He could issue more threats. He could promise the violence that would surely follow. But as he looked at the three of them, standing together against the backdrop of the setting sun, he knew it would be useless. He could see in their eyes that they would not be cowed. Forcing the issue would mean a fight, a bloody, messy affair that would be far more trouble than it was worth. His employer wanted her back pliant and broken, not to start a small war over a defiant woman in the middle of nowhere. He had lost. The battle had been fought and won without a single weapon being drawn. He held their gaze for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, he gathered his reins. "He will not be pleased," he said, the words a final, hollow threat. Without another word, he turned his horse and began to ride away, his back straight and stiff. The three of them stood together, unmoving, watching him go. They watched until he was a small, dark speck on the horizon once again. They watched until he disappeared completely, swallowed up by the vast, indifferent landscape. Only then did Ellie let out the breath she had been holding in a long, shuddering sigh. The strength that had held her up seemed to drain away, and she swayed on her feet. Silas's hand was suddenly on her arm, steadying her. She leaned into his strength, the trembling finally taking hold of her. He did not speak. He just stood there, his hand a warm, solid anchor. Until the shaking subsided, she looked up at him, her eyes full of a gratitude that was too deep for words. He had stood with her. He had trusted her to face her own demon, and in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift of all, the belief in her own strength. The storm had returned, and they had not broken. They had not even bent. They had simply stood together, and it had been enough. Silently, they turned and walked back toward the warm light of the cabin, leaving the ghosts of the past to be scattered by the cold autumn wind. The dust from the lone rider's departure settled back into the earth, and it was as if he had never been. The air, which had been thick with tension, grew light again. The setting sun seemed to reclaim its territory, washing the small ranch in a soft, honeyed light, erasing the long, dark shadow the stranger had cast. The world returned to its quiet rhythm. But something had fundamentally changed. The silence was no longer a fragile peace. It was a deep, unshakable certainty. Ellie stood on the porch, watching the last sliver of the sun dip below the jagged line of the mesas. The sky bled into shades of ochre and deep violet. The air grew still and cool, carrying the scent of dust and dry sage. It was the same view she had seen every evening for months, but tonight she saw it with new eyes. It was not just a place of refuge. It was her home, earned and defended not with violence, but with a quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. In the days that followed, a new kind of quiet settled over them, softer and more intimate than before. The last test had been met, the final ghost laid to rest. The skittishness that had always lingered in the corners of Ellie's movements, the constant, low-level hum of vigilance, was gone completely. It was replaced by a deep, quiet confidence that radiated from her. She moved with a sense of belonging, her feet sure on the ground she now knew was hers. Silas watched the change in her with a quiet wonder. He saw it in the way she laughed freely at Tom's antics, in the way she would meet his gaze across the dinner table with a small, open smile, free of any shadow. The haunted girl he had sheltered beneath his coat had been replaced by this strong, serene woman who had become the steadfast heart of their small world. He found himself seeking her presence, a quiet pull like a compass needle finding north. The work of the ranch was still hard, the days still long, but they were no longer a burden to be endured. They were the simple, satisfying substance of a life he was finally, fully, living. The first hard frost arrived, blanketing the ground in a glittering white quilt. The last of the yellow leaves on the cottonwood let go, drifting to the ground like golden coins. They finished their preparations for winter, their movements synchronized, their purpose shared. The cabin was snug and warm, the larder stocked, the woodpile high. They had built a fortress not of stone and timber, but of shared work and mutual care. One evening, after their simple supper was done, Tom, weary from a day of adventure with his dog, fell asleep by the hearth, his small face peaceful in the firelight. Ellie sat at the table, mending a tear in the boy's shirt, her needle moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Silas sat opposite her, cleaning a bridle, the scent of leather and oil filling the warm air. They worked in a comfortable, companionable silence. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire, the whisper of her needle through cloth, and the gentle scrape of his knife on the leather. It was a silence filled with 1,000 unspoken conversations, with the shared memory of hardship and the profound comfort of their present peace. Ellie finished her task, knotted the thread, and set the shirt aside. She looked at Silas, at his bent head, the firelight catching the silver strands in his sun-bleached hair. She saw the strength in his scarred hands as they worked the leather, and she remembered their gentleness, how they had held a wildflower, how they had steadied her when she thought she would fall. A wave of emotion, so pure and powerful it almost took her breath away, washed over her. It was a love as quiet and as vast as the desert sky, a love that had grown in silence and been tested in fire. She rose from her chair and walked to the open cabin door, looking out into the cold, clear night. The sky was a vast expanse of black velvet, scattered with the brilliant diamond dust of the stars. The moon was a sharp, silver crescent, casting a pale, ethereal light on the frosted ground. A sacred hush lay over the land. Silas finished his work and came to stand beside her in the doorway. He did not speak, simply stood with her, sharing the view. The chill night air wrapped around them, but in the small space between them, there was a profound warmth. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. For a long time, they just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, two small figures dwarfed by the immense beauty of the night. There was no distance between them anymore, not in body, not in spirit. She turned her head, her gaze soft in the moonlight. She looked at the worn collar of his shirt, at the strong column of his throat, at the hard line of his jaw. She remembered that first day, the terror, the desperation, the impossible hope she had placed in this silent, intimidating stranger. Her voice, when she spoke, was a bare whisper, meant only for him, a sound that was nearly lost in the vast silence of the night. "At first," she began, her gaze dropping to the floor, "I only wanted to hide under your coat." She paused, gathering her thoughts, her courage. She lifted her eyes to meet his. They were dark and deep in the dim light, and in them, she saw his own quiet, powerful emotions reflected. "But now," she whispered, her voice catching slightly, "now, I just want to stand beside you, always." The words were a confession, a promise, a declaration, all spoken in a single, breathless phrase. It was everything she had kept locked in her heart, finally set free. Silas did not answer with words. He was not a man for speeches or grand promises. His truth was always in his actions. He turned to face her fully, his body shielding her from the cold night air. He lifted his hand, the one that had held her steady, the one that she had held on to through a long, fevered night, and gently cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a touch that was infinitely tender. He looked down at her, and in his eyes, she saw it all. He didn't need to say the words. She saw the love, fierce and protective. She saw the gratitude, deep and abiding. She saw a look that held the quiet awe of a man who had discovered a precious spring in the middle of a desert. A man who had never expected such a gift and would treasure it for the rest of his days. It was an answer more profound than any words could ever be. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then his hand dropped to take hers, his fingers lacing through her own. It was a simple, solid connection, a perfect fit. He gave her hand a gentle tug, leading her from the doorway. They stepped down from the porch, their boots crunching softly on the frosted ground. He didn't lead her toward the barn, or the corral, or any place of work. He led her out into the open, toward the wide, moonlit field that stretched before them. It was the same field where, in another season, she had found the small, resilient wildflowers. The flowers were gone now, sleeping beneath the frozen earth, waiting for the warmth of spring to return, but the promise of them remained. They stopped in the middle of the field and stood together, his hand holding hers, their breath misting in the cold air. They were home, they were safe, they were together. They looked up at the endless star-strewn sky, a quiet man and a brave woman who had found each other in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Their silent promise was witnessed only by the stars, and it was more than enough. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to share your location and your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you really enjoyed it, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach even more listeners.